Between the quarks and gluons in the atom's nucleus with beams of electrons from the superconducting accelerator. CBAF has an educational mission as well. The CBAF Science Series features scientists and engineers who are gifted at making their work not only informative but fun. The Science Series is held once a month during the school year in the CBAF Center Auditorium. The presentation is live, spontaneous, and for the most part, unrehearsed.
Good evening. Happy New Year and welcome to the first program of the Winter-Spring 1996 Science Series. This series, we've got really a number of very diverse programs for you with outstanding and enthusiastic speakers. The programs will cover lasers and ultrafast phenomena in February, immunology in March, and in April, we're concluding with astronaut Katie Thornton talking about her experiences fixing the Hubble telescope and doing experiments in space. I hope to see you there. Tonight's speaker, Dennis Blanton, is the co-director of the William and Mary Center for Archaeological Research. He grew up in South Carolina, constantly searching the ground for clues to prehistoric civilizations. An interest stimulated when family members gave him some spear points that they found in the neighborhood. He received his bachelor's degree from the University of Georgia and his master's degree from Brown University in Rhode Island, both in anthropology. He is married and he has a 9-year-old son. He lives up in Williamsburg. He spent recent years looking for prehistoric camps and villages in, of all places, underwater in the Chesapeake Bay. And this research is the subject of the talk we'll hear tonight. Please join me in welcoming Dennis Blanton to talk about Atlantis in the Chesapeake, understanding prehistoric archaeology and sea level changes.
It's a pleasure to be here. I appreciate all of you coming out to hear this talk. It's an easy one for me because I get excited about this stuff. As she said, I've always wanted to be an archaeologist.
I'm not sure if your loudspeaker is on for the house.
Gee, I've got so many wires here. I don't. How is that one?
It's better.
I can hear that now. I look around and I see all these kids. A lot of people think of archaeologists as these old, bearded curmudgeons who huddle around in their anthropology department somewhere. That's not true. You can be an archaeologist regardless of your age. I want to get you excited about it tonight because there's a lot of archaeology in your backyard. There's a lot of archaeology in your neighborhood. That's what you should know. Now, this is kind of interesting to me to be at CBAF. I seldom speak at places that are renowned for serious, hard scientific research and study. Science and archaeology. Those are not usually two words that are spoken in the same breath. Now, why might that be true? Why not? Why might I be reluctant to talk about archaeology and science together, particularly in the classic meaning of science? Anyone have any notion about that? Let me help you. Archaeology, at best, is a social science. I'm not a physicist. In fact, one of the reasons I'm an archaeologist is because physics was a challenge, to say the least. Archaeologists, however, apply the scientific method. Now, why do we do that? Why have we adopted this approach that scientists use so successfully? The reason is it allows us to minimize subjectivity, and it really improves the quality of our results by being rigorous in what we do. Now, the subject of archaeologists is what? Now, do not tell me it's dinosaurs, because that's not the case. I like dinosaurs, but I don't get paid to study dinosaurs. We study people. People that lived in the past. In fact, my degrees and most archaeologists' degrees are in anthropology, which is really the study of man. Very important thing to remember. Humans, being our subjects, are tricky. They're some of the trickiest subjects you could ever hope to study. They're unpredictable sometimes, and they exercise this troublesome thing called free will. They're not simple organisms that react and respond to their environment in very simple ways, straightforward, predictable ways. They have this capacity for reason, which sometimes gets them in trouble, but it certainly complicates what I have to do. So science is interesting. I'm flattered to be here, though, nonetheless. Now, one of the things I can say that we try to do is take a multidisciplinary approach when we study these people in the past. And tonight's example follows that format. In particular, it shows how archaeology and other disciplines can work together to generate important results and bring meaning to the things that we see. In this instance, geology is the discipline that has the most bearing on what I want to talk about. I hope that by the time this is over, you'll be excited and turned on and want to explore archaeology yourself. If you're interested in solving problems, I don't think there's a better place to do it. Archaeology is full of some of the most interesting and complex problems there are. It's an extremely challenging field, and it's fascinating. So as a problem-solving context, if you like that, you would love archaeology. I like this stuff, and I always have. All right. Are you familiar with the story of Atlantis? Is everyone familiar? Raise your hands if you're familiar. Most people are. It's a common story. Let me just review it, though, quickly. The famous, well-known Greek philosopher Plato was one of the first to recite the legend over 2,000 years ago. And to quote him, he says that portentous floods and earthquakes caused the island of Atlantis to be swallowed up by the sea and vanish. That story has been passed down. It's come to us in different versions, different iterations, new twists, strange twists at times. But as we can see tonight, most of you are familiar with it. Because it's an intriguing story, a lot of people have spent a lot of time trying to determine how much truth there is to it, including a lot of archaeologists. A lot of archaeologists have been criticized for doing that. You're out of your mind. It's just a legend. How could this be? These things are tales of fiction. But is it really far-fetched? In fact, in another time, long ago, or maybe even today, someone might make the same claims for the Chesapeake Bay. Are you surprised to hear that? Probably so. And I don't mean literally that the Atlantis lies in our beloved Chesapeake Bay. What I want to do tonight is focus on why that is true to a certain extent, and to make sure you understand the most reasonable explanation for what I have seen in the course of my study. Now, this subject, this topic, has been my pet project for a number of years now. And it really came about as a lucky accident. Now you hear scientists, and archaeologists are no exception, that you'd rather be lucky than good sometimes. And that's true of me. There's a story behind this. We get a lot of calls. There are a lot of people out there, farmers, construction workers, gardeners, you name it, digging in the ground, turning the soil constantly, and they find things if they're observant, and they're curious about these things, and who do you call? Your neighborhood archaeologist. Now, I get calls all the time. I found this thing in my garden. It's big and gray, and it looks like thus and such. Can you tell me what it is? Usually it's a cow bone. More often than that, though, it's just a rock that has a peculiar shape. But I usually try to be patient and understanding and tactfully tell this person that you don't have a darn thing, put it back in the ground, and call me next time you find something neat. But regardless, I follow up the leads. No doubt about it, because you never know what you're going to find. Let me back up. I don't want to spill the beans yet. One of the calls that I got was Friday afternoon, sleepy afternoon. I'm thinking about the weekend. This gentleman from Kilmarnock, Virginia calls, and he says, "Got a minute?" "Sure." He says, "My neighbors are watermen, and they've been bringing to me for some years now artifacts, really nice artifacts. And I do my best to tell them what I think they are, but I really don't know. And I've seen so many, I'm beginning to think there's something important out there." He piqued my curiosity. "Now, tell me more, sir. What do these things look like?" He started to describe things that would be of interest to me or any other archaeologist. And he went on to say that they were finding these things several miles out into the bay, under tens of feet of water. I think, wow. I was incredulous. Is this really the truth? It hadn't been brought to my attention before. So I loaded up my son after arranging to meet them as soon as possible, which was the very next day. My son was about 4 at the time. He's up for a road trip, especially if it involves dad and artifacts. He's into that stuff. I'm trying to burn him out on it as soon as possible so he won't follow in my footsteps. What did we see when we got to Kilmarnock? We met with these nice watermen. And they had a spread, literally, out in the yard on a card table that would boggle your mind, if you're an archaeologist, that is. Now, a lot of these things that they found did not particularly excite me. My interest, personally, in archaeology is prehistory. What are these things? Shark's teeth, big ones, from extinct far. I'm not a paleontologist. They're neat. It's not my line of work. Sword hilts, bottles, brass ingots, spoons, gun parts, cannonballs, all that stuff. Lots of that. That's cool. I like that, but let's get a little older. Oh wait, what is this? It's a stone axe. Nice. That excites me. What are these things? Stone points. Wow. Hey buddy, what's that around your neck? Hey. Stone point. Got that way out in the bay, but I never take it off. Okay, well just hold your shirt open and let me flash a photo. These guys had neat stuff. All from underwater, every bit of it from underwater, way out there. Not along the shore on the beach, underwater. This was a dream for me. Wonderful things. The famous archaeologist, when he looked at open King Tut's tomb, his name was Howard Carter. Many of you might know the story. He cracked the tomb, shoved the light through the opening, and the people behind him said, "What do you see? What do you see?" He said he was stunned. Wonderful things. It's the way I felt that day. All right. Now let me tell you what's happened since. Where has this gone since then? More importantly, why would anybody really even be excited about it? So what? Ho-hum. Bunch of watermen find some artifacts. They're old, out in the bay. Big deal. I'll tell you why. Try to convince you why anyway. You can make your own judgment. If you study archaeology, one of the first things that you're taught about North American archaeology is that people arrived here by crossing a land bridge from Asia, Siberia. It's called Beringia. It crosses the Bering Strait, where the Bering Strait is now. About 50 miles of water there, 50 miles across. But 15,000 or more years ago, depending on who you ask, it was dry. Why was it dry? Sea level was lower. Sea level was a lot lower. Why was that the case? Because there were glaciers. There was extensive glaciation all around the world, especially in the northern latitudes. And we're not talking about valley glaciers of the sort you see here. It's kind of a neat slide. It's a classic glacier. But the ones from that period are continental glaciers of the sort that cover places like Greenland now. These glaciers were immense. They extended as far south as New York, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. Solid ice, some places up to a mile thick. A lot of ice. Of course, ice in another form is water. So all of the water, an awful lot of the water that was in the world's oceans was in the form of ice. Therefore, it depressed the sea level. We're aware also, I was taught, that this sea level change occurred widely. It's not limited to northwestern part of North America, off of Alaska. Happened here, worldwide. So, what I knew going into this were these things about sea level and human population here. In fact, in this area, when sea level was lower, there was no Chesapeake Bay before 10,000 years ago. Even really 8,000 years ago, there wasn't anything you could call a bay. It looked more like this. What the bay fills now is the ancient river valley of the Susquehanna River. It was dry. The Susquehanna passed through Hampton Roads, just north of it, really, crossed the continental shelf, and then dumped into what was the Atlantic Ocean. The James River passed through Hampton Roads, very close to the Susquehanna, made a turn to the south and did the same thing. But lots of dry real estate out there. Plenty of places for people to live. No bay. In fact, if you wanted to take your family to Virginia Beach 12,000 years ago, you'd have to add another half an hour on your trip to drive out there. If you're into surfing, there wouldn't be much in Virginia Beach. Virginia Beach would have been analogous to Newport News, its relationship to the ocean. Very different. Okay. We've known that these people that crossed the Bering Land Bridge spread relatively quickly to the eastern part of North America, including Virginia, so that by around 12,000 years ago, there were people here. We've known that. Now, one thing I want you to realize, that the glacier started melting and sea level started to come up. That water dumped back in the ocean. But this business about sea level rise that I'm going to talk about later did not happen like that. People were not running for their lives all of a sudden from this massive wave about 10 or 12,000 years ago. Very gradual, almost imperceptible process. In fact, you wouldn't have even noticed it probably except across several generations. Grandpa says that he used to live out there. That sort of thing. Would have been hard to notice. So having learned all of these sorts of things, we intuitively expect there to be these artifacts in Chesapeake Bay. We intuitively expect there to be sites, prehistoric sites underwater, but we never get to see the things. Until that day, I went up and talked to the waterman. It's the first time you really heard about it. So all of a sudden, I'm confronted with an archaeologist's dream. And I set out to explore it. Now, my job as an archaeologist is to reconstruct past life. Now, if I limit my activities here only to the sites that are on land, only to the places people live that are now dry, I'm not telling the full story. The only way I can tell the full story is to take into account these sites that are offshore underwater. That's why it's significant. Now, the Chesapeake Bay is a famous place. You hear about it, everybody knows about it. It's often described as the world's largest estuary. In the past, it's a very rich source of food, commerce for the area. And in spite of that, people have really given very little attention to the way human beings interacted with the bay thousands of years ago. People like the Native Americans that you see here, who made a living off of the bay. All right. Now, what's the cornerstone of my study? After that first day, when I met with these watermen, I set out to talk to as many people as I could. Do you have buddies who have this sort of thing? Oh, yeah. Give me their name and address. So this grapevine was established of contacts with watermen, like the guys you see here. Lots of these fellows have these things. You may know people yourself that have artifacts and work as watermen. If you do, I'd certainly like to know about it. But that's another matter. Lots of these people kept turning up these artifacts. Very proud of it. But watermen, you often hear, are slow to warm up to people like me. But after a while they did. They invited me into their homes and allowed me to take photographs and see the things they had. Now, how do the watermen find these things? Do they just drive out there in the boat and peer down into the water and say, there's one, and reach down and pick it up? Of course not. What do most watermen do now? What do they get out of the bay? Clams. A+. You betcha. Clams are a big deal amongst watermen. They have been. And they use tongs. Things called patent tongs usually, which are mechanized tongs, unlike the old hand-operated tongs, to pull these things up. Now what a tong is it's like two big garden rakes. They drop these things over the side, they're brought together to take a plug out of the bottom, it's hoisted to the top, and it's dumped out on this thing called a culling board. And that's where they look for clams. That's really what they're after. You see those plastic buckets behind him? They throw the clams in there. But they also throw artifacts in buckets a lot of the time. When they take these tongs down to dig the clams out of the mud, they're actually penetrating old archaeological sites. So they're bringing up a piece of these old Indian campsites that often have artifacts included. And if they're observant and they've got the time, they collect these things. In fact, I've learned if you walk around and look at watermen, look at their boats, if you walk along a dock where there are many tied up, you'll see these buckets full of fossils and artifacts. It's amazing. They think they're kind of neat, but don't tell too many people about it. Which drives me crazy, because I want to know. Here's an example of one fellow, Oscar Sederholm is his name, very, very helpful to me, displaying some of his artifacts. Now, what have we learned from this? Two important things. I've talked to about 10 watermen now, and I've been able to identify nearly 20 different sites. When I say a site, that's a place that people used to live. And the reason we know it's a site because there are concentrations of these artifacts there. So these blobs on the map are places where lots of artifacts have been found by the watermen. In fact, more than one waterman will find things in the same place, so we have an independent check of what's going on. So a pattern has begun to emerge with this sample. It's a relatively small sample, but it's a beginning, and I feel confident about what we're seeing. First thing that's important for you to remember, the kinds of things they're finding are consistent. They're not finding these small little pieces of stone that may or may not be an artifact. They're finding things that anybody would recognize as an artifact. Axes used to fell trees, big stone axes. Here's another one, lots of these things. I've never seen so many axes. I could dig till the cows come home around Williamsburg and not find an axe. These guys find them all the time. It's amazing. Beautiful tools like adzes, also woodworking tools. They find large spear points and arrowheads. There's no mistake about these things. They're only one thing, and that's human artifacts, human-made artifacts, more artifacts. Now, a lot of these things are quite old. We have spear points like this one, which is at least 11,000 years old, which confirms our notion that people were here very early. But most of these things, these stone axes and these big spear points, date to the time period we call the late Archaic. That's between about 3,000 and 5,000 years ago. So there's a pattern. It's simple. In fact, as a quantity, in terms of sheer numbers, most of these things date to that time, 3,000 to 5,000 years ago. We'll get back to that. I'll help you understand why that is. What's the other pattern? They're finding these things in consistent places. You talk to the watermen and say, show me where you found it. And they're very good maps of the floor of the bay, and they'll say, it's on an edge. I found it near an edge. This term came up over and over again. And it's illustrated in the slide behind me. If you look out in the bay, it's relatively shallow until you hit a main channel. In this case, it was the old channel of the Susquehanna River. It can be very deep out there, sometimes approaching 100 feet. The average depth of Chesapeake Bay, average depth is 22 feet. It's very shallow. So when you get a change, it's often quite abrupt. Now what these edges are they're talking about are really the terraces or bluffs that overlooked these old streams, which today, if you want to find Indian artifacts, if you like that sort of thing, go to the James River to high ground which overlooks it, and you will find, mark my word, Indian artifacts. Thousands of years old. No question. That same pattern applies underwater. All right. Now, if you look at the sea level curve, in terms of age, we have present 0 years before present, 12,000 before present. This is depth below sea level in meters. 12,000 years ago, sea level was almost 100 feet lower than it is now. Almost. And it rose very quickly. As those glaciers started to melt, it was fairly sudden. A lot of water was dumped back into the oceans. So it rose quickly and then tapered off. About 5,000 to 6,000 years ago, the bay filled. By 6,000 or 7,000 years ago, you had a large expanse of water that we would all probably recognize as an early form of the bay, version of the bay. Now, because the sea level rise rose so quickly, organisms of different types, particularly shellfish, didn't have an opportunity to adapt. The change was too rapid, we believe. But starting about 6,000 years ago, when things slowed down, you had this large estuary forming. The change becomes slower. Shellfish pioneered the area, and you began to see these vast beds of oysters, in particular, and clams. People are attracted to those kinds of resources, which are concentrated in one place. It's like a natural grocery store. If you're a Native American living thousands of years ago, your first priority was to feed yourself and the rest of members of your group. Why not make it easy? Go where the food is concentrated. So we're seeing lots of these sites appear at just the time the Chesapeake Bay became a settled estuary with concentrations of food. There's a correlation in terms of intensity of human use and availability of food. That's the explanation primarily that we're seeing, that I can make. Now, look around. If you live, you have to live here, obviously. If you cross Route 17, the James River Bridge, the old James River Bridge, on the other side of the river, it's a place called Ragged Island. It's a wildlife area, kind of a notorious spot, I guess, but an interesting natural area. That's what this slide is of. You cross the bridge and look out there at low tide, this is what you see. A drowned forest. So where today you see extensive salt marsh, not a tree could survive there at all, we have evidence that it was formerly a forest. Reason is, sea level was lower, trees could make it. Not the place today to put your dream house. You think it's a place only fit for fiddler crabs. And the average person seems to believe that it's always been that way. If I see a marsh there today, it's always been a marsh there. Don't believe that. Walk out there amongst those old tree stumps where there used to be a forest. where it used to be dry, and you'll find artifacts, prehistoric artifacts. People lived there. You couldn't live there now, not for very long. Other examples. What about Jamestown? We're doing a big project now at Jamestown Island. It's very exciting. Most people think of John Smith, Pocahontas. They're neat. There's a lot that happened before that. One of the things we've looked at is this question of sea level rise. We've been able, in working with geologists, taking cores out of the marsh to reconstruct the environment at different points in time. This slide shows the James River off of Jamestown Island as very narrow. It would have been deeply entrenched in a valley. It would have been in completely fresh water, and it would have been free-flowing, fast-flowing. It's not like that now, is it? It looks like this. It's very wide, it's tidal, in fact it's brackish, and Jamestown Island is much smaller. The contrast is like this. 12,000 years ago at Jamestown, you would have had rolling forest, rolling terrain covered with forest, free-flowing freshwater springs, beautiful place to live. Now it looks like that, same spot. All those ravines, which 12,000 years ago would have had nice little creeks, now are filled with marsh. Now we've seen how people have adapted to that. We've been able to chart how settlement has moved as the shoreline has encroached across the landscape. And we know that if we dig out there under that marsh, we'll find artifacts if we dig in the right spot. And that's what we've been doing. People drive by and they think we're out of our minds. Why in the world are you digging in that marsh? We come out covered with mud and, you know, we smell, but we're happy because we've got bags of old things that people left there. We've got the evidence of that. It's very neat. So it's really what an archaeologist would refer to as human ecology. We're understanding the relationship of people and the environment and how it's changed. Colonial period, sea level. Don't think sea level has stopped rising. It hasn't. Now I don't want to come in here and frighten you. Don't start running. You're safe. What's one thing you read about in the papers and you hear like global warming? If you're an adult, it's frightening to understand that all of a sudden the insurance industry has acknowledged there may be something to it, and all this coastal property they have insured is threatened. It's true to some extent, and there's evidence of it right beneath our noses. Look at old maps of the Chesapeake Bay. Here's an old nautical chart. There are places out here where shoals, sandbars, and small islands were shown, and those islands are completely submerged today. They cannot be seen. Now, if you aren't careful and you take your sailboat across there, you'll be grounded because there's not a lot of water above it. They aren't submerged very deeply, but they're there, and the reason is sea level continues to rise. If you go to Williamsburg, just outside of town, there's a nice little boardwalk. If you go on the boardwalk and you look below it at low tide, you'll see all these old logs placed side by side that stick out of the marsh. And not only one layer, but there's this layer on the bottom and there's another one above it. These are a series of old roads that have been built. This is amazing, very crystal clear testimony to how people have tried to adapt with these changes. The first road they put in became too wet, so they built up another level to it, and now they finally abandoned it. These old colonial roads are forced to be out of use. So look around, pay attention to what's out there, and you'll see these interesting things. All right. I'm not always right about this. I have this infatuation with sea level, and sometimes if you're a, quote, scientist, even an archaeologist, you look for patterns, and sometimes you think you see a pattern where you really don't. That's part of the process. You run into dead ends. Jamestown Island's no exception. If you go to Jamestown Island, especially in the 5 years ago, you would be told that the fort that John Smith built is underwater, it's offshore, it's been flooded. I bought into that big time. I thought that was the truth. And the reason is I saw evidence of sea level rise everywhere. And I wasn't misled. It happens. Sea level has risen. There's been a lot of erosion. But they didn't build the darn fort where we thought they did, it looks like. There are people doing archaeology now, and they put the fort on high ground, we think. So that is a story, if you've heard it, there's late-breaking news, fortunately, that the fort may survive, the first fort, in spite of the sea level rise, because they had the foresight to put it on high ground. So everywhere I've tried to make this work and explain things, it hasn't always been successful, but I'm happy about that case. All right. Now, what is the significance of this? I'm going to wrap this up here and allow you to answer questions. I hope you have some, because there's a lot to this story that we haven't gone into. First of all, we have learned that the terrestrial models that we use, the land models. In other words, I've looked at a lot of these sites. There are thousands of them documented. And like I told you before, very simple correlation. People like waterfront property. Just like today, they enjoyed it in the past. Not for the vista in the past so much, but for the food and the water. Practical reasons. So we've learned that we see a nice high ground adjacent to water, there's probably a site there. We now know that we take a map of the bay and the underwater, you see how these ridges, these headlands underwater extend outward, and where there are a lot of sites along the margins of these on dry ground, I know that I can go out there and find them underwater. So I can predict the locations of sites underwater. That's important. Another thing is, here shows predictions about where sites should be based on that. Primarily along these edges. Here's another channel right along the edge. The other thing is, it's interesting. If I excavate a site that's 3,000 to 5,000 years old on dry land, what's dry land today, I won't find a lot. They're usually very small encampments where one of these groups of hunters and gatherers stayed for a short period of time. We know from other places in the world that these people did have large camps where large numbers of people came together and stayed for longer periods. But we haven't seen those in York County, Newport News, Virginia Beach, Williamsburg, Gloucester County. We don't see them. But all of a sudden, the watermen start to come up with these big axes, great big spear points, precisely the kinds of things we would expect at a place where large numbers of people gathered for longer periods, but they're underwater. So we're seeing that the sites are there, but we have to go offshore to find them. So now the model that we have about where these kinds of sites are is coming together. It's coming together. So in effect, out there in Chesapeake Bay, we could argue that there is some version of the Atlantis tale. There's evidence of ancient cultures underwater, right here in your backyard. Now the problem for me, you might ask, where am I going to go with this? And you can help me maybe. I need to talk to more watermen. If you know watermen, that have artifacts and will be willing to share that information, please send them my way. Number 2, figure out where the main plug is for the Chesapeake Bay, and let's pull it. Because we've got to drain the thing before we can really look at these sites. The only way to do it now is to dive. You know what you see if you dive in Chesapeake Bay? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. It's by braille. And usually when you feel around there, you just find beer cans and engine blocks and things like that. It's a drag, because most of these artifacts are buried just a little, at least. So that's a challenge for me. I know the sites are there, and I want to get to the things. And it's going to be very hard for me to complete my life's work of explaining how people behaved in the past until I do. So help me figure out a way to clear the water, drain the bay, whatever. There's another issue out there that you might have thought about, and you would eventually, I'm sure. This will be the last thing. It's an interesting puzzle, though, in a way. Sea level rose, it swept across the landscape where people lived. What do we get wherever there's a shoreline? Erosion. Wherever there's a shoreline, there's erosion. Now, the million-dollar question is, how badly were these sites eroded as sea level advanced across the landscape? In other words, what I'm getting at, if I could drain the bay to excavate a site, would there barely be much left intact that hadn't been jumbled up by the wave action along the shore? I think there would be in places, because sea level rose fairly quickly at times, and also in these situations you get lower energy and higher energy environments. And those lower energy, where the wave action is less, we might be successful. So the work is going to continue, I can assure you that. There's a lot to do yet. And I hope this talk has informed you a little bit about how geologists, particularly with their contribution about sea level rise and my interest in people and their artifacts, come together to help us understand how people have adapted to Chesapeake Bay. Thank you very much, and I'd like to take questions if you have them. Are there any? Yes.
I attended a lecture several years ago by Jerry Johnson,
right,
and where he showed the maps he had been producing over a number of years for the rise of Chesapeake Bay and formation over 240,000 years. He suggested there was probably a rather sudden melt-off approximately 2,000 years ago, which resulted in a suddenly more abrupt rise in the waters of Chesapeake Bay. Do you find that accurate?
I think that is accurate. And I'll tell you, oh, I'm sorry, yes. The question was, which I'll repeat so everyone can hear, is that geologists, one in particular, Jerry Johnson, who's also at William & Mary, a colleague, has evidence that maybe sea level suddenly rose more quickly than it had been at about 2,000 years ago. And he asked, was there evidence for that? The best evidence that I see comes from elsewhere, really. There have been geologists who worked in Delaware Bay, and there have been geologists who worked further south that see that. And that's one of the things that's another talk in itself, are the finer points of sea level rise. The curves I show you are simplified, to say the least, to cover a broad span. But if you broke it down and took any segment of that curve, you would see that there are oscillations. And that's what you're talking about. There are pulses in this net rise. And there have been some cores in the York River that indicate that very thing. And there's evidence that people made adjustments to the way that, we find campsites suddenly moving at about that time.
If I might interject something,
Sure.
I'm a relic collector myself and what you might call an amateur archaeologist. But one thing I've noted on the Mobjack Bay in the Matthews County area is a preponderance of early and late archaic material and a paucity in a lot of the sites of woodland, especially late woodland material, which, in light of what Jerry Johnson and you were both saying about the water levels receding, is that fresh water was not then suddenly readily available in a lowland area like Matthews County any further because of the rise of the salt water, and that historically it had been suggested at least that Matthews County and some of Gloucester was a hunting reserve or kept something like that. I think probably because of the lack of fresh water. The larger base camps were pulled back or pulled to more upland areas where fresher water was still running.
Fresh water is always a problem. People have to have it to survive. The question, the comment really was about that relationship between sites and the need for people to have fresh water. In the later periods of prehistory, also an important factor is that these people made a real commitment to farming. You can only be a successful farmer if you have the choicest land. So you want land that's well drained, and people tended to move to those spots, higher ground often, which is sometimes away from the lower lying areas to get that. Are there any other questions or comments from the audience? Yes, sir.
Yeah, I know you probably won't take this question seriously, but do you believe in any kind of Indian spirits or whatnot?
The question from the back, first of all, he says he didn't know whether I would take this seriously or not, but do I believe in any kind of Indian spirits? I believe that the Indians believed in certain deities. You might call them spirits, what we would call gods. I personally don't know that I could, not being Native American myself. I'm not going to attempt to really answer that.
What's the evidence for it?
What's the evidence for it? The evidence for these things occasionally are ritual items, which you find really precious few of. Occasionally you do, but the best evidence comes from the accounts of early explorers like John Smith and some of the other English that described for us the Powhatan beliefs in various gods and that kind of thing. Their worldview, so to speak.
I live in a neighborhood where they did a lot of archaeological digs, and they dug up a lot of Indian skeletons and whatnot, like full ceremonial gear and all that. And then there's been a lot of weird deaths and stuff. Like a bunch of people committed suicide, and a bunch of people that in the neighborhood.
Yeah, well, those coincidences between the excavation of these Native American remains and deaths and of your neighbors and so forth are something I would encourage you to keep a close eye on and try to figure out yourself. Yes?
Being out of state, or I'm from Massachusetts, and somewhere I read, if my mind serves me right, that maybe the area like Cape Cod and Martha's Vineyard was all in some way connected, maybe along peninsula. And as you look at today's maps, there's a space between the state itself and then Martha's Vineyard and Cape Cod. Do you think maybe some type of a storm or hurricane could have forced that water level over that skinny peninsula and then allowed it enough to drain out of some other area that would bring the ground back up?
Sure. I think that sort of thing happens a lot. The New England coastline is very different from ours. One of the things you see in New England is there's a lot more relief there. And that's an important thing about Chesapeake Bay. I mentioned that the bay's average depth was only 22 feet. And if you drive around here, you'll see that there aren't very many big hills. It's relatively flat land. So, for really a small rise in sea level will flood a very large area for that reason down here. In New England, it takes a greater rise in sea level to flood an equivalent area because you have more relief. A lot of the shoreline is rocky, there are cliffs and things of that nature. So the effect of sea level rise has occurred there, but it hasn't been to the same degree, particularly for this later period where people are involved. Yes?
What do you think really was the earliest date that there were people in North America?
The question was, what do I believe is the earliest date for people in North America? I hate questions like that. The reason is there is controversy, of course, like so many things. In North America, still, North America, the most reliable dates still cluster around are somewhere between 11 and 12,000 years ago. There's increasing evidence, however, even from Alaska, the northwestern area, part of the continent, of earlier occupations. So I think we're going to begin to see it. But some of the most intriguing evidence comes from South America, sometimes in highland areas, of sites that date over 15,000 years ago, and in some cases maybe upwards of 20,000 years ago. Now the problem with that is the comfort zone is not great enough for anyone to go out there and declare that we've settled the issue, because these sites really occur in isolation, or there's only one or two. It's when we get things in greater numbers, sort of in an aggregate, the sample increases, that we become more comfortable with the notion. So that's my safe answer. I do believe, to be honest, that probably we're going to see and be able to safely say there's people came here between 15 and 20,000 years ago. Probably. In Virginia, I don't think it's going to change a lot. I think it's always going to be 12,000 at the earliest, more commonly 10 to 11. Yes?
Yes, you described over the years how much the level of sea level had increased and the amount of erosion that had taken place along the shoreline. And yet it didn't seem like the waterman's tongs would go down very deeply to bring up some of those artifacts. How do you explain that? Are they that close to the bottom of the Chesapeake Bay?
That's a good question, which is the waterman's tongs do not penetrate that deeply, probably a foot at most, and probably on average less than that. But they're still finding these artifacts. How can that be? Until we get down there and take a close look at some of these